So for your third presentation of the year, you guys are going to be doing podcasting. So I'm going to be here actually a few times throughout this process to help you with the technical side of things. But today, to kick things off, we have Brian Bartel and Dale Basler here with us. They do work in the school district. They're technology coaches as well. They used to be science teachers, and
We still are
science teachers and tech coaches. They started a podcast, like my old boss used to say, before podcasting was a thing. You guys have been doing it for 13 years? 14 years?
Yeah.
14 years they've been producing the Lab Out Loud podcast.
Wait. How many of you are 14 years old?
Yeah.
Kind of creepy.
Yeah. So they've been podcasting for a long time. They're here. They're going to share a little bit of their process, how they plan and prepare and create podcasts that they share with a wide audience. So it's Brian and Dale.
Before we start, I got a little trivia here for you. I have two things for you to figure out. One of your teachers and I went to college together and lived in the same dorm room together.
Oh, really?
One of your other teachers and I, but I don't think we ever took a college class together. One of your other teachers and I took a college class together and worked on a project together. And we worked a lot of work on it. Actually, it was like a digital project. It was a digital publication. We only got a B on it. It was kind of disappointing, but yeah. So, anyhow, thought I'd share that. You have to figure all that out before the end of the hour here.
How many teachers are here? Four. Okay. I mean, how
Only
many?
two right now.
Two right now. Okay.
One of those teachers is here today, and another one is not. I'll give you that hint. How's that?
Are you gonna guess? Is that what you're saying?
Wait.
Hang on, I gotta ask.
All right.
Where are you from?
So I was born in Alaska, but moved to Wisconsin when I was 3 and a half. Lived all over the state though. So
All over the
Eau Claire, Cedarburg, Appleton, and on Alaska. So does that help?
You go to school up north?
Absolutely not.
So it's not Deming.
I had to figure out geographically where I was in comparison to that.
So it's not Steve Deming.
Is that your final guess?
That's my
Steve
eight
DeMay,
guess.
final answer.
It is not Steve DeMay.
You
You whittled it down to now 3.
I taught Dave Debbink. Isn't that a connection? I taught that was in okay, well, that was the trivia portion, apparently.
We'll give you another chance in 20 minutes.
My name's Dale Basler. I feel almost like I was going to say Mr. Basler, but Dale Basler, and this is Brian Bartel. And how did the podcast start 14 years ago? Might be where we start this discussion. 14 years ago, the term podcast actually was barely in existence. And I don't know if you know this, but the podcast craze has been through several cycles already. And we're in a new renaissance of podcasts right now. A lot more podcasts are emerging as fictional, things like that. Whereas
Branded
in the
podcasts.
past, branded, limited to certain subscriptions and things like that. Back when we first started, and still like today, if you were doing a podcast, it was free and it was just out there. It was just, a lot of it was all passion projects, and a lot of podcasts are still like that today. So we started in 2006. We were both science teachers, and we were involved with our science teacher professional organization. So there is a Wisconsin Society of Science Teachers, and there's a National Science Teaching Association. So both of us well, it's because the organization just had a name change, so I was going through that mental jujitsu. So we decided I think I was like, I wonder what this podcasting thing is, and I wonder if we can do this. At the time, we were both involved in our science teacher organization for the state. And we thought, well, might this be a new way, a new medium to use to kind of get information about teaching of science, what's happening in the state, and kind of out there. So we did, our very first year, we called it periodicity. If you understand the periodic table, periodicity is the repeating pattern that's on there, and so we kind of made that connection to science teachers, and we did 52 episodes, 1 episode a week. and that was usually interviewing a guest. Now, the first episode was Brian and I
Reading science news.
essentially reading, like Science News today, and kind of going through there. It's like, so it was silly. If you listen to it now, it's like, good Lord, it's hilarious. The audio's funky, all kinds of stuff. But through those 52 episodes, it helped that we didn't have children. We both have kids
You did.
now.
You had one at least.
No. Well, yeah, I guess I did. We didn't have children. You're right. We did have children, but they were small.
I did not.
I have teens now. They're more, I have kids your age now, so it's harder. Or it's just driving more. So we had more time to do it because we still had a full-time job and full-time job of teaching, and so this kind of supported it. And then we went through that whole year. And then at some point, because we're involved as a state level, we're also involved as a national level with science teaching. We talked to the national organization, and they came to us and said, hey, you're doing this for the state. How about we have you do it for us? We were doing it just for fun. And then they said we could pay you a little bit. Now, we're not getting rich off of it, but it was enough to kind of keep us going. And
It's enough to keep our wives okay with us going down to the basement for a few hours.
yeah, and so after that point, that's where we're in our 13th season. We did 16 a year, and now then it got bumped up at some point to 20 a year, and sometimes it kind of changes. And so ultimately we do a podcast every fortnight, every 2 weeks, not the game. But if you go on Spotify, it'll say this podcast runs every fortnight. It's like, well, how do you know? But and then summers we take off. And so we don't do shows that much during the summer, and that's the rest of the history. So that's what's been going on. And then each year, I don't know, we probably just try something new and add different things to it, and then that's where we left off. That's where we are. I think it's just kind of been going and going and going. I kind of want to give you a chance to. This is definitely, since you're all in a circle, and you're taking notes and things like that. Please raise your hand and ask a question. If there's something that you're like, how does this work, or what did you do? The really technical aspects of that, we're probably not going to get into because it's going to depend on what you want to use or can use here at your school. But I would say, if I can leave you with anything, I'm going to leave you with it right now, is that you're telling a story. So that's the most important part. The sound effects might come to mind, or music in the background, or all of those kinds of things. I would say all of that comes secondary to the main thing of the story. Who is your audience, and why do they want to listen to this? That's the key. What story are you're telling? And it's really helpful to tell a story that you are connected to. That is something that you're sharing about your life, your perspective. That's key, because other people are going to listen to this, and they're going to come with all these assumptions, and if you have them finished halfway through the show going, whoa, I didn't even think of the world from that viewpoint, or that lens, that's a big deal. So that, I think, is always your target. Any kind of frills and music and all those kinds of things are great, but you should always kind of hold off on that and get your story down first. That's my little soapbox for starters. Any questions? Yes, ma'am?
Did you ever have like experiments that bombed and you decided that was a bad idea and we're not going to do that anymore with podcasts?
Yeah. Well, there was one year that we wanted to start a tradition where we would interview the editors of Science magazine. It's a big publication for science news, and they do like a story every December or January, like the biggest news of last year. And when we contacted the editor, they did say, yeah, let's try this out. But it was hard to do with her for whatever reason. And then we asked if we could use an image, and they basically shut us down completely. So we don't do that again. So we thought this would be kind of like a talk about, every year we would connect with this magazine and talk about the top science news stories of the year. We've had those kinds of issues sometimes. We've had a couple episodes where we've hemmed and hawed of, do we really want to broadcast this? sometimes gets solicited by people who want to. We'll talk a little bit about how we get guests, and one of the things is usually it's me searching out for someone that we think is interesting. Dale sometimes gives me ideas of, hey, this person would be interesting to talk to. He just did that to me a couple weeks ago. It's something that I have in my feed right now that it's a professor who figured out a different way to solve the Pythagorean theorem. Right, so that's like, hey, that's pretty cool. Let's talk to him about that and get him on the show. And so that might be something we'll see in the future. I don't know. However, there are times when other entities contact us. So just last night, I got an email from.
This happens easily several times a month.
Yeah, we get someone talks to us and says, hey, we have an idea for you for the show. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes they're bigger names and they just don't fit for whatever reason. Sometimes we try to space things out. So, for instance, we were contacted by an author of a children's book series, and we've had her on the show before. And if we do too many of them, we have to think about, well, are we giving unfair bias towards this person over other people? The vendors are a tricky one there because they're selling a product. They obviously want the free press, and so and we also have to think about our reputation endorsing a product as well, and if we really think it's good for science education. So we don't try to necessarily land on a product, but sometimes there's something that's novel enough that we say, you know what, let's do that. We've also had,
Can't think of anything that straight up bombed. We've had like technical failures. Like last year I had one of the biggest, like, lost everything after this huge edit.
like you forgot to save it before this computer
and
crashed.
It's not a fault, forgot to save it, is what I have like systems in place to continuously back up, and something just completely miserably failed with that software, and then I had to start completely over. And there's nothing worse than like editing something all down to where you get it, and losing the whole thing and starting over. And there's maybe my kids might have learned some new words that day. It was very sad. That only happens once in a while. Sometimes we have most of our shows are guest shows. So we have it's Brian and I asking one or two, once in a great while, 3 people questions and about a topic. So there's been once where we lost the entire other side of the interview. So then what do? You're just gonna listen to yourself ask questions. So the one time we called that person back and they did it. And then there was, and sometimes that's the other thing is, and if you're thinking about doing this, you're gonna do a show where you're gonna interview someone else, what do they have for technology is always a tricky part, because what if they sound horrible? So my advice there is, get it out of the way in the beginning. Have that person on there. We often ask is, what did you have for breakfast today? Get them talking, kind of get that. That's the other thing is, if you're gonna interview someone, so they're not, maybe they don't do it all the time, so they'll be nervous. And so you kind of get them talking and be recording that, kind of get things going. That allows you to make sure things sound okay. They're not in a spot where it's scratchy or noisy and stuff like that. Kind of get that stuff out of the way first. And if it is bad, don't be afraid to say, we're struggling to hear you a little bit. We want the show to be good, that kind of thing. And almost all the time they adjust to like, oh, let me switch to a headset, or oh, I'm using a speakerphone and it sounds really echoey, and they switch that and stuff like that. So we've had cases like that where I think in the early shows we might have been a little more hesitant to ask the person, and we wish we would have afterwards, because the person on the other, the way you frame it is that we want to represent you the best we can too, so we want to be able to hear you. So just recently, a couple of episodes ago, we did a show with 2 guests, and it's like they both had audio problems. We wound up redoing part of it because it was too important of a topic.
It's like one guest was talking while scratching the microphone with sand.
Yeah, it was like an ASMR sort of podcast. That's not what
Maybe
we're
that's what it was going for. But we had another podcast where we interviewed Bill Prady, who was the executive producer for The Big Bang Theory, and he, as a big name, we often have to schedule through their company or whatever, and they set up and they say, he can talk to you at this time. And so sometimes that means that we have to reschedule all of our day just to make that happen. And so he gave us a time, he gave us a window, and we have this much time. I think it was 20 minutes, and he had to cut it short. There was an emergency, and he's like, I'm sorry guys, I gotta go, and boom. So we were kind of right there in mid-interview, and so we salvaged it because we were able to kind of pick up from there, and Dale moved some stuff around with audio, but sometimes that happens too, but most of the time we can recover from that.
I think you're gonna make one podcast, right? You're gonna make one file. So for us, it's a little different because we're always thinking about the whole longitudinal work that is
Is it
our show. You know, so
reproducible? Can we
so on
replicate it?
we post our shows on Mondays. Like this Monday, episode 222 will go out, and so we have our episodes by number. It's like the TV shows do the same thing. They have episodes and then they show by number. So show is when we record, and episodes when we release, and that gets kind of, sometimes they line up and sometimes they don't. It works out really well that Brian and I have worked together for so long. He's a chemistry and biology person. I'm a physics and earth science person. So right there, when we seek out stuff, we're kind of like seeking out opposites. So sometimes I don't know anything about biology, so I look at it from a novice lens, and then that becomes a show. So it helps to do a show with someone that you don't necessarily have similar, share the exact same things. That can be an asset. But it also helps, though, to be able to work with someone who, like Brian does a very good job at booking, which means he kind of hunts down all these guests and, is communicating with them back and forth, and a lot of like the little setting up the times and all that stuff. That's all him. And quite honestly, that sounds like awful work. Like, I don't like that. It just does. And it works out that I think I do the stuff that I like, and he does the stuff he likes.
Most of the time, yeah.
I think that's just the way it does. So
We'll talk later. No.
Yeah. Scroll up 7 like,
No.
It's been like 14 years and I've never told you that I hate doing it.
Yeah, a few years ago we created this presentation for NSTA, the National Science Teacher Association. Back then it's now the National Science Teaching Association. That's why Dale threw in that teachery. But anyway, we put this together for those teachers.
There's a 19 too.
Yes, but it doesn't have this.
Oh, got it.
This was mostly a presentation on how to make the podcast and what we have from that. So we can go over a couple pieces there. But this is basically the kind of flow chart that we work through. So we have ideas, and actually at the beginning of the season, Dale and I a lot of times in the summer will kind of think about like, do we have a direction we want to go? And sometimes that happens just inorganically, organically. Yeah, organically, where this season we've had a theme running through called Scientist Out Loud. And what happened was, it's something on Twitter that happened where someone was upset with a scientist and decided, I need to find other good scientists to follow on Twitter. So they start putting out this list of people they follow on Twitter that are scientists. And it was refreshing. I was like following people, and I started hitting people up. Would you like to come on the show and talk?
It was like an example of cancel culture on social media that led to something good.
So we started, well, first of all, following these people on Twitter has also kind of cleaned up my Twitter feed a little bit so it's not as negative. But the second thing is that it gave me a lot of good ideas for guests. So we started this piece called Scientist Out Loud. And one of the other ideas, and I've had this brewing in my head for a while, is we do a lot of shows that are geared towards teachers, which that's really the whole point of the podcast. However, we sometimes have students listening in too, and there's a couple of really great episodes that teachers tell us students listen to all the time. And
we also know it's being played in classrooms because they're showing up in the referral URLs. So the links as to where the podcast is playing and our statistics are all in learning management systems. So we know teachers are posting them in Canvas or Classroom or Blackboard or things like that. So
in any case, so we wanted to figure out ways that we could talk, have shows, have some conversations with guests that would talk specifically to an audience maybe like you, who may or may not be interested in a career in science, and that was the real goal. So we've now had 5 guests, counting Monday. We have another one in production, basically, that's ready to go out from this Scientist Out Loud. Yeah, it revolves around baboon poop.
I'll just tell you, she collects baboon poop
In Namibia.
But it's not like you find some poop and you pick it up. She has to know which baboon pooped which poop, because they're testing for diseases and stuff. And when you think about like disease studying, this is like, why on earth is someone going and, you know, basically diapering baboons? Because they want to get ahead of a disease and be able to know the big picture. So when, let's say, a big virus comes out afterwards, we have some people that kind of know how the world works a little bit. So that's what's going on. It's what we call basic research, and it's really necessary.
Turns out that baboons are model organisms for viral and disease transmission, basically, that we can think about in terms of what we learned from that population translates very well into what happens in human populations. So that's why they're doing that research. But she was talking about collecting the poop and then having to transport the poop. She calls it poo because she's from England. So I had to collect the poo, and she says it dainty like too. It's fantastic. You'll have to hear it on Monday. But anyway, she talks about taking that and transporting it through the airport. And the kicker is they have to have a system to name their animals. So
they have an informal system to name them.
They've just decided to call them after infectious diseases. So this one's called Ebola, this one's called SARS, this one's called
so it tests
the
through
plague.
malaria coming through TSA. Imagine how that would look.
Once she gets the poo back, she can do a lot more with it. But in any case, it was kind of interesting there. But again, we wanted to have a series of episodes, and as we have right now, that were geared towards scientists actively working in the field, and that could speak to maybe what their careers are like, how they got into the profession, and almost none of them have a linear path. So when we think about like becoming a scientist, what does that look like? None of them basically said, I want to become a glacial geologist. That was our first one. And he basically was talking to us about his career path and how he didn't start studying glacial geology. It basically came out to that's where he ended up. And he spends a lot of his time in research out in Greenland and discovered some really shocking things about climate change. And it was interesting because that one, he talked to us and gave us the results, but he's like, when is this coming out? And we're like, well, boy, what's going on? And he has embargoed information. He can't release it because the publication doesn't come out till a certain time. So our podcast came out after that publication, but when we recorded it, it was like top secret. Not really, but I mean, yeah.
Well, top secret for a scientist.
Yeah.
The other thing I think about when we're in this ideas thing is if you are going to, and show of hands of anybody who thinks they're going to interview someone for their podcast. Is that actually a thing? Okay, so let's see if these come out. Here's my plug for that, and we tell teachers who want to do podcasts too. Don't be afraid to ask any of them. Call them up, contact them via social media. The worst thing that can happen is you're exactly where you are, is a no or no response. So we've had all kinds of great, like for a science teacher, like a famous person, it's like Bill Nye and like Neil deGrasse Tyson. It's like, oh, this is for us.
Adam
it's
Savage.
Like the
two
Mythbusters guy,
Mythbusters.
like Mythbusters people, and they're like, oh my God, this is that's a famous person for us. But if I told my dad, he'd be like, who's that? But still, they're busy people. When Adam Savage was still doing Mythbusters, so it was around. They have very busy schedules and stuff like that. But it never hurts to just straight up ask. You might get a no, you might get no response, but it's just worth it. It's worth giving a shot. So don't be afraid. You have a hook too. You are, like for us, I think it helps that we're science teachers, and when you're contacting people who, if we take like Adam Savage from Mythbusters, he's a sciencey person. You can kind of tell. If we're coming to him with science teaching, that's probably important to him. So it kind of probably tugs at their heartstrings and says, I want to do that. Yours is your students. They want, adults like to inspire people. So they're going to want that. They're going to want to do that. That's an asset as you're coming from there. So
one of the things that we've learned is that sometimes we've been very surprised at the people we can talk to, like Bill Nye. Part of the deal of me booking people is that I have Bill Nye's personal contact information.
You just text them once in a while?
No, but
hey, can I get this?
I just told it like, ooh.
Take a picture of a mole.
And then there's been other people who you'd think wouldn't be that hard that are impossible to book, and I don't know exactly why. I have a white whale of someone that we've been trying to get on the show, and I keep hitting her up every now and then. It's Donica McKellar. For some of the older people in the crowd, she was from Wonder Years, but for some of you now, she stars on movies for the Hallmark Channel. But she's also a very prominent.
She's a PhD mathematician.
Yeah, she's a mathematician basically, and so she has spoken about how, especially girls, the importance of math for girls, and so I think that we wanted to have her on the show, but we've been turned down every single
She
time.
must be
so.
too good for podcasting.
I gotta find her in the off season, so when she's not recording movies for Hallmark Channel, which is probably right about now, is my guess. But anyhow.
But unlike Brian, don't take it personally. Just push on to the next person you're gonna ask.
But we do get a lot of people that they say no. They say we can't do it or we can't do it now. I have a couple people who have said I can't do it now, but can we come back to this in a few weeks? University researchers, professors, often are a really good source, partly because they may have grants that actually speak to, there's a part of the grant that talks about education outreach. And so it's actually something they have to do for their funding. And so we are actually serving a purpose for them. They're using us probably more than we're using them. So it really does work out well. The hardest part of doing an interview with someone like that is how do you record the other side? And that's probably that'll be the trickiest part for you that way.
Questions? Yes.
So that was gonna be my
Yeah.
next question, is you brought up recording on the phone and.
So
you
let's
do
talk
this
about it a little
whenever,
bit. Let's go back all the way to the beginning in 2006.
Yeah.
What are our costs for doing the podcast? Well, we have to have a computer, of course. That's one thing there. We run Skype, so we have a Skype handle, each of us, that we use, and we connect with each other. Since I do the booking, I usually get the contact information, and for about
Is it? You know what Skype is, right? Yeah. We don't use it a lot in our school, so I wasn't sure.
do they know what Skype is? Come
Well,
on,
you never
Lauren.
know.
So Skype is what we use, and there's nothing, we don't pay for Skype. However, I pay about $10 to $20 a year to get something called Skype Out. So when we connect with a guest who doesn't have a Skype username, then we have to call their phone, their home phone, their cell phone, etc. And then that does charge it. It's a very, very, it's not much at all. We've even called people from the UK. That works out really well because the time frame there, when we call it like noon for them, it's like 6 a.m. for us, so we can do that all before school. But that's one of the things to consider is just the cost for calling people.
Been a goal that we haven't been, is trying to hit every continent. We're trying to get a scientist in Antarctica. We haven't done that yet.
We still
That's a goal.
have things to do.
Yeah.
So that's one thing as a cost, is about $10 to $20 there. Dale pays for the hosting for the website called Lab Out Loud, and that's somewhere in the neighborhoods of $50 to $100 a year. That's not something you'd have to worry about probably, but we also have to pay for the hosting, and that's where we store the files for the podcast. We use a product called Libsyn, and that's still $6 a month. It was $6 a month when we started in 2006. It's still $6 a month now.
It's because we have a legacy program.
That's what we
You know,
have.
like if your parents never changed their cell phone, then you have that
Yeah.
old bill.
And
It's the
what
same thing.
we're allowed is a certain bandwidth of file storage every month, basically. Since we only do 2, maybe 3 episodes a month, we don't hit the limits there, so that we're able to kind of skirt under that.
There's a lot of services out there now. I mean, a lot. There's a decent amount of services out there now that will allow you to host the podcast. They handle, like what we use for Libsyn, they handle all of the distributing it to like they'll add Spotify and they'll add all these different things, so it just kind of gets out to these connections instead of having to do, because otherwise you have to, when we first started, you had to do it one by one. And you're like, I'm gonna make sure that people that have Android phones can get my podcast, because that became a thing and then you had to do that. But now the services kind of do that all for you, and then the advantage is that they bring in all the statistics into one space and kind of do that. So that makes that a little bit easier. So and I know that Mr. Zimmerman's kind of looking at some options for what that is. But as far as recording the person on the other end, another option is just to ask them. A lot of people are, they're pretty familiar with their iPhone and they know how to just do a voice recording. And so you say, we're going to have a conversation on the phone, but can you just do a voice recording at the same time and then share that file with me? And then using like software editing, like Audacity is probably the software that we'll probably introduce or that you guys will use. You can just put those files together. And you know how they do in a movie where they come by and say, action? We do a very scientific clap at the same time, just to try to sync up tracks through that audio, and that kind of lines everything up that way. It's easy. It's what a lot of even professional podcasts will do, is use a clapper and have that all sync. Yeah.
Do you do multiple takes when you're interviewing?
We always tell the guests, so we always give our guests like disclaimers at the beginning, like we do the spiel so many times I don't even know how to say it, but we always go through like this is a podcast, it's not being recorded, it's not live, because sometimes we'll have a guest that still is not. Podcasts are pretty popular now, but when we first started, they're like, "What's happening? Is this the radio?" They could say, "No, this isn't live. We won't put words in your mouth. We won't redo, splice together and kind of like try to deepfake their voice or something like that. We may move segments around or edit for time. We kind of give them those kinds of things, and we also tell, like, if you make a mistake, if you say something that you can't share, we had someone that shared like a contest that their organization was doing, and then they realized they couldn't share it yet, so they would just say, cut that out or redo that. Brian has a dog that sometimes gets in the podcast. My kids, when they were little, they would be in the podcast, and then I'd like have to mute it and walk around the corner and be like, and try to be quiet, because we're just doing this in our home. It's not
we're in our basements, literally.
Yeah.
And Dale will pull together usually 3 tracks. One comes from the recording program that we use with Skype, and there's a handful out there. And then we each record in Audacity, so that Dale can slink those together. And if there is a significant piece where I'm like coughing or my cat jumps up on the table, he can just edit that piece out of it. So 3 different tracks, he can kind of edit that stream out if needed.
So ultimately that makes me the producer and editor. If you look at that, and then I think you're also a producer, but
I'm a producer from the
other end of
setting up and getting everything set up that way.
So they are actual jobs, but that way. Yeah, I do all the editing of the show, down to the point where I've heard Brian's voice so much that I can recognize it in waveform almost, and just be like, oh, I know.
You're familiar with the Matrix, right?
Yeah.
Yes. He's like, yeah,
Like,
red dress, blue dress.
when
He knows what I sound like.
And the other thing is, like, if you get really good at it, if you've ever done, well, I mean, like, you understand, like, shortcut keys for video games and things like that. It's the same thing if you're doing video editing or audio editing. If you watch those people, they have all the colored keys and different things like that, and you start, using your shortcut keys and all that kind of stuff, and it just starts to happen automatically. That first one you do will take forever, but then after that it gets faster and faster and faster. Like anything, like any kind of creative work. The other thing is, if you find yourself going down, I think when you're creating anything, if you find yourself going down in a direction where you're just like, it's the expression kill your darlings. Like if you have something and it's just like, I love this thing, but it's really not what it was, what I wanted it to be is not what it is, and those kinds of things. Sometimes you just got to start over too, and that's just the way life works. And you chalk that up as not a loss or a failure. You chalk that up as I'm sure that your school kind of probably exemplifies, is that you learn from that. So.
Nice segue. We to the next slide. What have we learned? So there's been a couple things that we've learned along the way. We've been doing this obviously, over a decade now. As Dale mentioned, it's pulled us out of our science comfort zone, so I'm not as comfortable with the physics and geology side of science, and Dale isn't as much with chemistry and biology, so we have a decent balance. And I actually have a list of all 222 episodes, and I sort through that. I think about that all the time, where are we being too biology heavy now? Am I being too physics heavy? Are we being too secondary heavy? And because Dale and I work in the elementary schools now, we have included a lot more for the elementary science level. So that's pulled us out of our comfort zones, I think, as well. As Dale mentioned, go to the source. Try to go right to the person. If you remember I mentioned the Science News person who couldn't give us permission to use the artwork from that magazine. The key story from that conversation, I went right to the author, found the author, asked them for the paper, and just took a screenshot of that. So sometimes going to the source is a little bit better. Contacting people isn't hard. You're going to find a lot of times that, you might get turned down. However, you will find that there'll be people that say, that's good. And there's sometimes the most intriguing conversations we've had were the most unexpected ones. We had Brian Mallow on the show a few years back, and he's a science comedian. And you wouldn't think like, oh, science comedian, but we had a great conversation talking about the similarities between teaching and the way he sets up his show. It's almost like lesson planning, and so it really it turned out to be a really good show. So sometimes those ones that you don't expect to be really good conversations actually turn out to be some of our better ones. And sometimes those key people, sometimes we'll ask people questions and they'll just give like a quick short answer and we're like, keep going, keep going. And then there's other times people won't shut up, they keep talking.
They're like right now, yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
One thing I want to think about is like, I think we're doing a lot of conversation because we think about our podcast as a series because it is. But maybe we should think about like, because they're doing a single episode, probably their first episode, like what does that look like? So if we take our baboon poo lady, that's not fair to call her. If we take, I forget what her name is.
She has a name, Kasravi.
Kasravi, there we go. And we talk about like how that episode came to be from start to finish. Step one is you stumbled upon the
content.
We had the idea of scientists out loud. So that's kind of something we're looking for as a whole. So we're putting our ideas together. And then you stumbled upon her contact information and set up the connection and scheduled the time and got all that and recorded it. And I think she would have been the perfect kind of person where you could have asked like, hey, do you have the ability to record this on your side? Like we've had people that do podcasts, they just record their side and send us a file. That doesn't happen a lot, but if you have someone who you think is on the other end is tech savvy or something like that, go for it. So then we make the connection, we call her, and we just, like I said, we start off with some sound checks and we do the disclaimer about like, what's going on and we're, kind of get people comfortable. And then our show always lets the person kind of introduce herself and say, tell us, and Brian almost says it all the time, they're like, tell us
who are you, what do you do?
And what do you do? And so then they kind of go into that, and then we do that for two reasons. One, it's kind of keep them talking and get them going. But the other thing is, it's easy to look up someone and see what it says on paper about what they do, but I'm really interested in what that person is going to say who they are, because that is usually at that moment what's important to them. They're going to talk about what's important to them.
And sometimes the internet's wrong about what they do.
Yeah, and they'll also say their full name because we need them to pronounce their full name so we get it correct afterwards, and because we deal with all kinds of different names that we've never said before.
Like this one. How do you say that one?
They can't see that, right?
Gajcek.
Right.
Elizabeth Gajcek.
So
sometimes that pronunciation is, you record it. You hear them saying it themselves. That's how they say it.
So once we get that kind of off the ground, so I would really kind of keep that in mind that you want to get the person comfortable and kind of get them going. Then we start going into the questions that we want to ask. Now there's two of us, so we are pretty good at knowing when we're pretty good with each other as knowing our intonation as to when I can ask the next question and he can ask the next question, but that's because we've been doing it so long. I would recommend, since it's your first time, this is what we did way back in the day, is we write out scripts, and sometimes we still do. It depends on the show. We don't always write out scripts. We wing it a lot because we have a long history of being able to do that. I shouldn't say we're winging it, but we don't have to plan to the letter.
Let me intercede here. A lot of times we will have guests ask us, do you have questions to address? And I say, no, that's not the way we do it. We keep it conversational. We let the conversation lead us where it may go. We'd like to cover these topics, but we want to hear it somewhat off the cuff from you as well. So we don't want scripted questions. In fact, we had a scripted one not too long ago because this was a big name. I don't know if any of you read XKCD. He's a comic artist and one of Dale and my favorite people that does it. And he was kind of hard to talk to because he was very, you would ask a question, he'd give you this most concise answer. So it was less of a conversation and more of just a straight up Q&A. So that one, the scripting failed a little bit.
But I think it's probably necessary for this being your first time that just like movies are made, shows are made, they're storyboarded out. Same thing here. That you need to plan out those questions because your guest deserves that. Your show you're going to invest this time into that and have those questions. Absolutely, leave some room for some spontaneity. Don't be so wrapped up in the questions that you're going to ask and the next question that you're going to ask that you cheat yourself out of listening to the response. That's a lot of times, sometimes still the hardest thing is that we're making a show and you start in that mind and you forget to actually listen to it sometimes in the moment. You will listen to it again, and when I show because you forget that you're not in the, so that's going to happen anyways, but kind of be on guard for that, to actually have a breath and listen to the person talk and kind of go from that. Speaking of breaths or pauses, or if you screw up, you know,
Sniffles.
you can cut all that out. So,
Yeah.
so if there's a lot, like there are long, awkward pauses in our show sometimes, because him and I are not asking a question, and there are definitely times where I just don't have anything to say in my head. I'm still maybe processing what the person said, or I just can't think of a transition, and it's really long, and it's all of a sudden, and then one of us jumps in, and then we kind of go, or the guest starts talking. But I cut that out. I mean,
Actually, we had a recent guest.
I edit
who
that out afterwards.
Talked with a lot
Yeah.
of pauses, and it was painful.
Almost to
listen
the point where I use scripting in Audacity to remove moments of silence. You can do that actually, but I didn't. But you do have to do that sometimes too. You're not trying to put words in people's mind, but you want them to sound good. So we had a guest once that had. It's tricky because I don't want to change the way they speak, or I want to represent them who they are, but I also don't want to make a show that's hard to listen to. I think that's key. The people can get through a lot if the story's good enough. They'll hang on. It's something if it's hard to listen to, like scratchier, noisier, super bassy that you can't hear. That'll kill a show no matter what. So
I think about it like, why do you clean your house before guests come over? No, that's a question. Why do you do that?
You look good.
Right, because
I own good
okay.
ideas.
Well, you're like, wait, what? That's a thing? No, because if you don't clean the house before they come, that will become an issue. You clean the house to make it a non-issue. So as Dale's saying there, you want to remove those things that make it a non-issue in a sense. So if you don't want it to turn anyone off, you don't want to restrict them. You don't want them to be feeling like this is a chore to listen to.
questions, because we have 10, 11 minutes left, so I want to make sure we have questions before we dart out of here.
I want you guys to think about your task, and your idea that's starting to form about what you want to do, and then call on their experience. Let's have a challenge of like 5 questions that apply directly to your task.
Yeah.
How do you usually come up with ideas for a specific episode?
For an episode, or for just the overall season, or?
For an episode.
Sometimes so a really easy thing for me is I set up an alert in Google. You can set up an alert and type in keywords. And so I have science news. I also have science education. I have NGSS, which is the new standards for science teaching. And so every time that pops up in the news, Google searches for that and gives me a digest of where I see science news. So sometimes we get really like obscure guests that have a good conversation that I just found from that feed coming up. A lot of times I ignore it because we have too many guests, and they're at a point where they contact us now, like we talked about, and we've had to turn away guests. We have some like waiting in the wind that I said we might be able to do this. Just hang tight. We'll see what the rest of the season turns out as. Like I said, that Twitter one, reaching out to people on Twitter, they were very helpful in wanting. I still have more people that want to do some recordings with us. So
Our show is always
Yeah.
an interview show, so the way I get, so like your question of how do you get your ideas, like we're not doing the work. The researcher, whoever we're calling, who made the book or the TV show, is doing all the work. So ultimately, it was all their ideas. So it's really for us. It's like, what ideas do we want to shine light on? Now, when we do talk to people in science education, when we talk about that list we have, we kind of like pick topics that are just that we're interested in. So that's all we're doing, is essentially saying, I want to learn more about this, and I have a podcast to do it. So that's all I'm doing is basically trying to make a show out of something I want to learn more of. As a matter of fact, almost all of my things that I make are me trying to learn more about something. And if it becomes a product, it does, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. So that's like the bulk of the way I learn is just to like, I want to figure this out. So then I decided, like I was telling Brian on the way here, I ripped the Blu-ray last night, not because I needed Iron Man on my computer, because I just wanted to see how this all worked, and I did.
Never mind the copyright implications of it.
It's my copy, I can do it.
The other piece of that is
But I mean, it was just me, I had no real, I was just figuring it out, so my ideas come from things I want to figure out myself, or things I'm interested in, and run with it. And don't be afraid of your own things, the questions you're interested in, because you're not the only one who is curious about a particular topic.
I would recommend try to stay local as much as you can. It would be a lot easier for you to be able to connect with someone locally, whether that's, look at the Post-Crescent, look at websites for Lawrence University or St. Norbert's or UW Oshkosh. There are people doing some intriguing work there that you may not know of, and that can actually, they definitely want to share what they have learned, what they want to reach a larger audience to that too. So that's a lot of times what we do on a bigger scale with science education, but there's no reason that you can't start small. And there's, in fact, we have a very fantastic research base in Wisconsin through UW-Madison, and we have to actually look beyond Wisconsin a lot of times because we don't want to feel too biased about what we have here. And we have a fantastic resource here. But yeah, there are other universities elsewhere. So.
Another idea is just argue with yourself, because you might be the actual story. It might be something that you're sharing, your perspective. And then I would say that you could make a show about sharing your thoughts on something, and you could also add like the contrarian side of that or something like that, an argument with, challenging yourself, saying, I view the world this way, it's narrow, this is the way I view it, but okay, there must be other people who think the other way. Let's try to widen that net and see what that looks like, see what the whole picture looks like.
I think it would be interesting too that one of the most popular podcasts, or at least little vignettes out there, is something called StoryCorps.
Conan O'Brien?
Oh. StoryCorps, where the whole basis of it is people connecting with usually family members or friends and asking them a specific time in their life. And so it could have been like connecting with your grandfather about their experience in the Vietnam War, or something else that was a significant piece there as well. And I think don't underestimate your own family.
I guess you have been listening to other podcasts. This helps me get ideas for sure. Also, stylistically, how I want my show to sound by listening to other podcasts, I've taken from that. So our show didn't always start off with like what we call a teaser clip. So the show always starts off like you're listening to Loud Out Loud podcast, and then it goes through the introduction. And in this episode, we're talking about, and then it has this little teaser clip. It's basically I look through the whole show and I try to find like 25 seconds of the guest saying something that is what I think is the essence of the show. Usually
support for Laugh Out Loud is provided by NSTA, the National Science Teaching Association. Find out more about what NSTA
that's trying to
has
get,
to offer
you always got to
at
keep them listening. Right?
nsta.org.
So listen to the different pieces.
This is
You're listening to
the
Laugh
Cool
Out
Waters
Loud
Band
Science
from
for the
Appleton.
Classroom and beyond. And today our Beyond is in a tree farm learning about trees.
The trees that we purchase to plant in our fields are usually 3 years old. From that time, it takes 8 to 10 years to become an 8-foot Christmas tree. So we're always looking out, 8 to 10 years, trying to plant the right quantity, the right species, and then Mother Nature comes in and she gives us rain or drought or whatever. So it's a long-term investment and a long-term care to make sure that tree matures into a saleable, beautiful Christmas tree.
That's up next on Laugh Out Loud, but first I'm your co-host Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartel. All right, so a couple things in there quickly. First of all, Dale has wanted to do a Christmas tree episode for years. I finally found the right, they were perfect guests for this as well. One year we called up the Butterball hotline and just asked them turkey questions. So
We literally
have
just
fun with it.
bombarded
Yeah.
some lady on the Butterball
We try
hotline
to focus on
with
science, but
turkey questions like where do the turkeys go? What do you do with the feathers? And she was like,
she was really good about it.
at first she was like,
so-
is this a prank? And then afterwards she realized what
So what clips did you hear in here? There was like probably 5 or 6. What'd you hear? Yeah.
There was the introduction and like sponsors.
Sponsorship. Dale already talked about another one, the music from Cool Waters Band.
Yep. Listen, he's a former East.
That's another track that's
It's my college roommate.
that's lying down below. What else?
Teaser clip and introduction of hosts.
Teaser clip and then our introduction. So you actually have quite a bit right in there, just in the first 1 minute. And again, that's all Dale putting it together. And so again, Dale looks through and finds a clip that kind of teases it, and that's like if you thought that was something that was eye-opening for us, astonishing to think about. That if you ever get a live Christmas tree, and that's been in the ground almost a decade before you cut it down. Isn't that amazing to think about?
Aw.
Yeah.
And then you throw it on the curb.
No, you put it on the.
They get chipped and mulched and they have new
They go
life. They
through.
talk about it. Some of them actually recycle them at the
Well,
farm.
we
You
even
gotta
asked-
listen to the episode though. So
We had to sheepishly ask, like, okay, so can we talk about artificial trees? And then you're just like, oh, we don't want. It's like Sharks and Jets, West Side Story.
we have time for one or two more questions
Yeah.
real quickly. Yeah.
How do you guys handle mixing?
Are you talking about sound levels mixing?
Yeah. Just
We have no mixer. So because this is done all over, you can have like a TriCaster, which would bring all this sound in, but it costs tons of money. So all in Audacity. So all done with compression tools in Audacity.
Dale or Isaac, you're gonna go over Mr. Zimmerman. Excuse me. He's gonna go over Audacity at some point in the future, right?
So, like levels, for example, like if one guest is louder than the other, like if a lot of it is just done by, same headphones, same thing, listening to it. But like if Brian is too quiet, I can just essentially adjust the gain. But normally I do this thing called compressor and stuff that level it out. So there's a couple different pieces, tricks that are in Audacity that will literally look through the whole file and try to say, all right, this person's quieter than this person, and level it out.
So yeah, I mean, and it's as simple as I can cut that out and delete it.
You can drive yourself crazy trying to get it perfect. So be careful about that, because you're going to hear it the best thing you can do is play it for someone else. And if there's something in there, like what I hear right away is the room noises. And these hover cams are notorious for making a real echoey kind of sound, which you can try to take out in Audacity, but you might drive yourself crazy and mess it up afterwards. It's best to play it back to someone who hasn't heard it yet, and just see if there's like, hey, is there anything? How do you feel about this? And if they don't say, if it's not a distraction, then don't worry about it. You're gonna hear it. It's like when if I paint a room at home, if I paint something in one of our rooms and I make a mistake, I know where all the mistakes are. But people that come and see it, they won't even notice. So you don't drive yourself nuts with that.
Dale asked me two questions usually on the podcast. How does it sound listening in the car? And
Yeah.
how does it sound listening with some kind of headphones or earbuds or something like that? Because those are the two areas where it's going to be listened to the most.
I do that actually. Sometimes narcissistically listen to my
All comes
podcast.
back to poop.
But listen to your production on different speakers. If you're going to be playing them back here or something like that, try to get a feel for it. I did recently make some adjustments with sound levels because I felt like it didn't sound right in the car. And your headphones are biased. That's the thing. So your headphones you'll tune whatever you're listening to your show in. You'll tune it for how it sounds for those speakers or that input, and then you go play it somewhere else and be like, oh no. So
We do have to run, but one last quick question.
Oh, I have one more thing to add to that. Take a really professional show, like I said, Conan O'Brien's show is like millions and millions and millions, but we listen to Reply All. Take a clip from them. They're a huge podcast, or any NPR podcast. Take one of those, put
They've
that
been
into
doing radio for a
Audacity.
while.
That gives you an idea of where your levels should be for the setup that you have, because you know that those are engineers looking at it. So put that into your Audacity and kind of get your levels to match that on the system that you have. That's another way I do it.
One last question before we need to go.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier, maybe a disclaimer that you read or recite to potential interviewees. Do you have suggestions for us? Like, should we script out a little like, hi, I'm
Yeah.
a student from
Yeah.
Valley New School,
I think that's a great idea, actually. Yes, this is who I am. This is why I want to do that. And we tell them straight up, you are being recorded. We anticipate that this will be released in 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, depending on. Sometimes, you know, we don't. We're recording so far ahead that we don't exactly know how it'll fit. At this point, you want to showcase to them where do you think this is going to be broadcast to. You don't necessarily know that right now, but you do. You have an idea of we want to put this on a website somewhere where we can share it with the world. So is it going to be public? Is it going to be internal? Those are definitely important things there. We are recording so we can edit things out, but we are not intending to change the meaning of our conversation. We might edit out a couple snips. Dale mentioned that we edit for time sometimes, or we rearrange things, but we will not change the nature of the conversation.
I don't think we've ever changed the show. Did we ever have to, was there one time we had to go back and take something out or change something?
You've taken one show and split it into 2 before, and that kind of changed the tone of it.
I'm trying to think if we've ever had.
You've
so
removed a couple sections around.
At some
Nothing major.
point, we, from advice from other podcasters in essence, is the idea of having sort of a audio release and getting that other person on the other line to say, oh yeah, because we'll say like, does that, how does that sound? And they'll say, okay, yes, good. Just some sort of like verbal, I don't think you guys really have to worry about this, but like we have like some verbal agreement that yes, you're being recorded, and so that 2 weeks later they'll be like, what? This is online now? That's what we decided to do. Also at the end, our show, we say that the views and opinions of our guests, like we can do.
The views and opinions do not necessarily reflect those of Valley New School or the Appleton Area School District.
Yeah, something like that. We have that at the end of our show because we do not necessarily, if our guest says something that doesn't align with, let's say, NSTA, which is footing the bill here, that's okay because we say that in there, and that's the nature of our show, is that they may have something that might deviate from a position statement.
I tell you what, if you were to come up with a universal script of something that you would include on every podcast, something similar to that.
All on the same. Yeah, that would be a good idea.
We could record it for you if you wanted to, and you could have put that at the end. Like the views and opinions do not necessarily reflect Valley New School, the district. Just put it at the end.
Oh.
Just for fun. We would do it for you. So you can have the opportunity of splicing in different audio.
Oh.
But
That's cool.
anyhow. But yes, if you do need to, if you have other questions, obviously you have Mr. Zimmerman. Mr. Zimmerman knows how to get in touch with us too, so feel free to contact us as well if you have questions along the way. We may be able to help you, we may not be able to, it's hard to say, but yeah.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Really quickly, just to maybe wrap up. As professional podcasters with many years of expertise,
Amateur.
amateur,
Yeah.
semi-professional.
We're just long-term amateur podcasters, I guess.
Do you have, we're gonna be looking at a wide variety of topics in several different ways, probably as an entire group. Do you have anything out there that we should just not do? Like, are there certain things that like, do not do this, this is just gonna equal bad podcast, or this is gonna be so cliche, there's already 90 people out there doing this, or do you just say, no, follow your passion, do something if you think it's interesting, or, and I don't know, that could be processy, but it
Oh.
also could be like product-y.
I know one for sure, and this goes for
Yeah.
all videos that you make and all audio pieces. Don't waste people's time with I question how long our intro is sometimes.
Okay.
Get to it right away. There used to be a point where people have a big sing-song introduction and stuff like that. Only HBO does that because they have the money to do it or something. People usually want to get right to the show, so that would be one thing I think of is don't front load it with too much fluff.
More
get
isn't
right to
always
it.
better either. There's a talent, there's a skill to be succinct, to have a little brevity in how you're talking. Not that we modeled that to you today, but in the same breath, it's important to again.
This is a good question. I feel like I'm going to walk back to our office and think of things that you shouldn't do, and if I do, I'll email.
But we all also learned that on the internet there is this sky's the limit of topics out there, and you can be brought to. We found some really crazy topics. 2 years ago we talked to someone who teaches science to inmates in Massachusetts prisons and how the challenges that they had there. And I never would have ever thought are you gonna talk to someone about teaching science in the prison system? And, you know, there's,
Well-
yeah, we get surprised by our topics, but.
I know, don't pay a guest to talk on your show, that's for sure.
Okay.
We've had like one or two people, like an author or something, they thought they were gonna get paid, and they're like, next. No, don't ever do that. Cause especially you're promoting their stuff, so it doesn't make any sense. Trying to think of something else that would.
I would just be careful that you're not in it to, you're not investigative journalists. This is not a gotcha moment.
Yeah.
I think if you become better in that in the future, maybe that's a career path that you could look at, but people like honesty, people like you to be authentic, and I think sometimes just, again, radio has succeeded for many years just simply on trust, and that speaks volumes of what you can do with a conversation with someone.
Don't try to tell someone else's story, I guess. Try to tell your own story. It would be something I think about. Like, you don't want to. There's you know, you can try to emulate or copy other people's styles, but it really has to be your show. It has to be your thing. So don't be afraid of that. Steer into that.
But also accept your own individuality and uniqueness. Dale and I have our own kind of like creativity, but it's not something that everyone would appreciate. But the nerds that love us for who we are.
We're huge in Wyoming. It's a long time show.
All right, let's move on.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Good luck.
When are all these done?
That's a great question. Sit for just a second and I'll tell you that.
Have a good one.
Because,
Enjoy your weekend.
June, right?